Somewhere beneath the jungle floor of modern Mexico, buried under 1,000 years of roots and soil and silence, lies a city so vast it once held more people than ancient Rome. Its temples still stand, its plazas are still paved, its astronomical observatories still point toward the same stars they tracked a millennium ago. But no one lives there. No one has lived there for centuries, and the people who built it left no explanation, no written account of what went wrong, no graves marking a final catastrophe. They simply ceased to exist as a civilization, and the jungle swallowed everything they were. This is not an isolated story. It has happened again and again across every continent on Earth. Advanced civilizations, cities of tens of thousands, empires that stretched across continents, trade networks connecting the known world, all reduced to rubble or silence within the space of a single generation. History calls these events collapses, but that word sanitizes what they actually were. These were not slow declines, they were erasures. And what makes them deeply unsettling is not just that they happened. It is that in most cases, after more than a century of archaeology and scientific investigation, we still cannot fully explain why.
The first thing you need to understand is what a true civilizational collapse actually looks like from the inside. It does not look like a war you can point to on a map. It does not look like a plague that fills mass graves with identifiable victims. A true collapse looks like a city that was fully functioning on a Tuesday and completely abandoned by the following spring. It looks like a scribe in the middle of recording inventory, suddenly setting down his reed stylus and walking out of the archive forever, leaving the tablet mid-sentence on the desk. It looks like ports that received ships from 6 different civilizations going silent in a single decade. Archaeologists call the physical evidence of this a destruction layer, a specific stratum in the soil where everything changes at once, where the pottery changes, the building style changes, the trade goods vanish, and sometimes the bones of the people themselves become scattered and unburied. When a destruction layer appears at a single site, it is tragedy. When the same destruction layer appears at 47 sites across 3 continents within the same 50-year window, it is something that history has never adequately explained. The Maya were not one kingdom. That is the first mistake almost every casual observer makes about them. They were hundreds of independent city-states spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, each with its own dynasty, its own priests, its own armies, and its own calendar system tracking celestial events with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for another 800 years. At their peak between 250 and 900 CE, more than 2,000 cities dotted the jungle landscape. Tikal alone covered 60 square miles and housed 90,000 people. Caracol in modern Belize was home to more than 100,000. Palenque carved inscriptions into stone that recorded dynastic history stretching back centuries. These were not primitive settlements. They were sophisticated urban centers with hydraulic systems, raised agricultural fields, paved roads connecting cities across hundreds of miles, and a writing system capable of recording complex historical narratives, astronomical observations, and theological arguments. And then, between 800 and 950 CE, nearly every single one of the southern lowland cities was abandoned. Not conquered, not burned in a single cataclysmic event. Abandoned. The last dated inscriptions at the great cities simply stop. Tikal's final monument was erected in 869 CE. After that, silence.
With the stalagmites of Belize told researchers changed the conversation about the Maya collapse permanently. Stalagmites grow at measurable rates in cave environments, and the chemical composition of each layer records the rainfall of the year it formed with extraordinary precision. When scientists analyzed stalagmite cores from Belize, they found that the period between 800 and 1000 CE was not just dry, it was the driest interval of the previous 7,000 years across the entire Maya lowland region. Rainfall during the worst years dropped by as much as 70% below the annual average. That number needs a moment to absorb. 70%. The Maya agricultural system, a marvel of engineering that fed millions through raised field farming, required consistent seasonal rainfall. The reservoirs carved into the limestone bedrock of cities like Tikal stored enough water for years of normal drought. But a 70% reduction sustained over generations was not a drought the system could absorb. It was a slow suffocation. Crops failed, reservoirs evaporated, the surplus grain that fed the armies and the priests and the monument builders disappeared. And with the surplus gone, the political and religious authority that depended on it collapsed just as completely. But here's what the drought theory alone cannot explain. The northern Maya cities survived. Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Edzna all continued to thrive for centuries after the southern cities went dark, despite existing in the same general climate zone and facing the same rainfall reductions. If drought was the sole cause, the northern cities should have fallen too. They did not. The largest cities with the most complex agricultural systems were precisely the ones that collapsed first and most completely. The very sophistication that made the great Maya cities so impressive was also what made them catastrophically fragile when the rains failed. They had optimized for prosperity in a stable climate, not for survival in an unstable one.
In 2334 BCE, a man named Sargon of Akkad did something that had never been done before in all of human history. He conquered not just a city or a region, but an entire civilization. He united the warring city-states of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq, under a single ruler for the very first time, creating the world's first empire. Under Sargon and his successors, Akkadian power stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the mountains of modern Turkey in the north, a territory of extraordinary agricultural richness, watered by two of the world's great river systems. The empire developed standardized weights and measures, the first postal system, professional standing armies, and administrative networks sophisticated enough to coordinate food distribution across thousands of miles. Akkadian became the international language of diplomacy that would dominate the Near East for 2,000 years. At its height, the capital city of Akkad was the largest and most powerful metropolis on Earth. And then, within a single century of its founding, everything collapsed. The city of Akkad, the capital of the world's first empire, vanished so completely that archaeologists have spent over a century searching for it and have never found it. Not a trace, not a foundation stone, not a single shard of royal pottery. The greatest city of the ancient world is still missing.
At the site of Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, archaeologists excavated the Akkadian provincial city and found the collapse preserved in devastating detail. Below a layer of wind-blown sand 3 meters deep, the city had been thriving. Above it, nothing. The sand layer itself was the record of catastrophe. Tests on soil samples showed fine wind-blown particles, no earthworm activity, drastically reduced moisture. Evidence showed skeleton-thin sheep and cattle that had died of drought, and the remains of up to 28,000 people who had abandoned the site within a very short period. Cave stalagmite data from Iran, positioned directly downwind of the Akkadian heartland, provided a precisely dated record of dust activity that identified a catastrophic drought beginning around 2200 BCE and lasting approximately 300 years. This was not a bad season. This was the complete and permanent desiccation of the agricultural north that the entire empire depended upon to feed its armies and administrators. What followed was not a gradual decline. It was cascading systems failure. The northern grain supply vanished, the army could not be fed. Nomadic groups from the periphery, the Amorites and the Gudians, poured into the weakened heartland. And across the region, the same disaster unfolded simultaneously. Egypt's old kingdom fell at the same moment, entering the chaotic First Intermediate Period, marked by famine and the collapse of Pharaonic authority. The Liangzhu culture of China's Yangtze River Valley, completely unconnected to Mesopotamia, collapsed at the same time. The Indus Valley civilization began its long decline. Researchers now call this the 4.2 kiloyear event, one of the most severe climate disruptions of the last 10,000 years. It struck the entire ancient world at once, and no civilization that depended on predictable rainfall survived it intact.
In the same century, the Akkadian Empire was collapsing under drought. The largest civilization on Earth was quietly beginning to dissolve. The Indus Valley civilization covered more territory than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, stretching across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Over 1,000 cities have been identified. At its peak, the civilization housed somewhere between 1 and 5 million people in urban centers of extraordinary sophistication. The city of Mohenjo-Daro was laid out on a perfect grid, with streets wide enough for ox carts, public wells on every block, and a drainage system running beneath every road that would not be matched in Europe for over 3,000 years. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a massive public pool fed by an intricate plumbing system, still stands. Standardized bricks across the entire civilization suggest a centralized building code enforced across hundreds of miles. Merchant ships from Mohenjo-Daro traded directly with the ports of Mesopotamia. Indus seals have been found in the ruins of the Sumerian city of Ur. And after 1900 BCE, all of it simply stopped. The cities were abandoned one by one. The population dispersed into smaller rural settlements to the east, and the Indus script, a writing system found on thousands of seals and tablets across the civilization, was never written again. No text survives explaining what happened. No myth, no legend, no oral tradition preserved by the descendant cultures names the disaster or describes the flight. As of today, the Indus script remains completely undeciphered. Tamil Nadu's government offered a $1 million reward to anyone who can crack it. No one has. The greatest urban civilization of the Bronze Age collapsed without leaving a single readable word about why.
In 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was the most connected region on Earth. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters with Hittite kings as equals, addressing each other as brothers, and sending gifts of gold, ivory, and fine linen across hundreds of miles of diplomatic courier routes. Mycenaean Greek merchants sailed alongside Cypriot traders, carrying copper ingots stamped with royal marks. Tin from mines in Afghanistan traveled overland through Persia and across the sea to reach bronze foundries in Greece and Egypt. A single shipwreck excavated off the Turkish coast, the Uluburun wreck, dated to around 1300 BCE, carried cargo from at least 10 different civilizations on board simultaneously. Royal scribes in Syria corresponded in Akkadian with officials in Egypt and Anatolia, using a shared diplomatic language that connected worlds as different as the Nile Delta and the Aegean Islands. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia. Ugarit in Syria was the greatest trading port in the Mediterranean. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece exported pottery and weapons across 4,000 miles of sea lanes. This was the most sophisticated international system the ancient world had ever built. It was about to be wiped from the face of the earth.
Within 50 years of 1200 BCE, every major Bronze Age civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was burned and permanently abandoned around 1200 BCE. The palace at Mycenae was destroyed. The palace at Pylos was burned so rapidly that the scribes had no time to remove the clay tablets they were inscribing, leaving them to be accidentally baked and preserved in the fire, capturing the final administrative records of a dying civilization. The wealthy port of Ugarit was sacked and never rebuilt. The last tablet recovered from Ugarit's archive reads, in translation, that enemy ships had come, the cities had been burned, and terrible things had been done. That tablet was abandoned mid-sentence. 47 major Bronze Age sites show destruction layers concentrated within the same 25-year window. The climate record confirms a mega-drought lasting from roughly 1250 to 1100 BCE across the Eastern Mediterranean, the driest period of the entire Bronze Age, documented through pollen analysis from ancient lake sediments. Earthquake evidence shows a cluster of major seismic events striking infrastructure across the region during the same period. And then there are the Sea Peoples, the mysterious invaders that Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III fought off in the Great Naval Battle of 1177 BCE, depicted in triumphant carvings on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu. The Egyptians recorded their names, the Peliset, the Teker, the Shekelish. But 3,000 years later, we still do not know with certainty who they were, where they came from, or why they were moving. The leading theory is that they were themselves refugees, populations displaced by the same environmental collapse they helped spread, a wave of desperate migration that became a wrecking ball tearing through the surviving palace economies. The most complex and interconnected civilization the ancient world had yet produced collapsed in a generation. Literacy disappeared, writing systems were lost. 3 centuries of darkness followed before the new Greek and Phoenician world slowly assembled itself from the ruins.
In 1986, workers digging clay from a pit at a brickyard in Sichuan province, China, struck something hard, then something else, then dozens of somethings, and within hours, archaeologists were standing before the most extraordinary Bronze Age cache ever found outside the ancient Near East. More than 400 bronze artifacts, gold objects, jade pieces, elephant tusks, and cowrie shells lay in 2 large rectangular pits. They had been deliberately smashed or burned before being buried. Among them was the largest freestanding bronze statue ever made in the ancient world, a figure standing over 8 feet tall with an impossibly slender waist and enormous grasping hands, its arms outstretched in a gesture that no one has ever fully explained.
There were bronze masks with protruding eyes larger than any human eye, staring outward with an expression that looked less like art and more like terror. There was a bronze tree nearly 13 feet tall, covered in birds and flowers and hanging ornaments, believed to have been a ritual object connecting the earthly world to the heavens above. The civilization that produced these objects is called Sanxingdui, meaning 3-star mounds, and it flourished in the Sichuan Basin between roughly 1700 and 1000 BCE. It was one of the largest Bronze Age cities in all of Asia. It had trade contacts reaching South Asia, the Near East, and the courts of the Shang dynasty in northern China, and it left no written records whatsoever, not a single inscription, not a word. When archaeologists excavated the site further, they found that the city's great walls had been deliberately broken, its water systems had been altered, construction had halted mid-project, and every precious religious object had been burned and buried in sealed bits. Around 1000 BCE, the city was completely abandoned. The people moved approximately 50 kilometers away to a new city called Jinsha, taking some of their artistic traditions with them, but leaving their religion, their giant masks, and their bronze gods sealed in the earth. The reasons remain almost entirely unknown.
For nearly 1,500 years, the Minoans dominated the Aegean world. From their palace complexes on the island of Crete, they controlled maritime trade routes connecting Egypt, the Near East, and mainland Greece, growing wealthy on the movement of copper, tin, textiles, and luxury goods across the Bronze Age's most important sea lanes. Their palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia were architectural masterpieces of labyrinthine complexity, multi-story structures with indoor plumbing, elaborate drainage systems, and walls painted with extraordinary frescoes depicting dolphins, priestesses, bull-leaping acrobats, and the flowing blue waters of the sea they ruled. Minoan art was so sophisticated and so distinct from anything else in the ancient world that when British archaeologist Arthur Evans first excavated Knossos in 1900, he initially refused to believe these ruins were Greek at all. The Minoans developed 2 writing systems, neither of which has been fully deciphered. They maintained diplomatic and commercial contacts across the known world. They were, by any measure, the most culturally advanced civilization in Bronze Age Europe. And approximately 90 kilometers north of Crete, in the middle of their most important sea, sat the island of Thera. In approximately 1600 BCE, Thera erupted with a violence that registered a 7 on the volcanic explosivity index, the same magnitude as Tambora in 1815, the eruption that caused the year without a summer and killed tens of thousands through famine across the northern hemisphere. The eruption ejected roughly 60 cubic kilometers of material into the stratosphere, generated tsunamis estimated at 15 to 50 meters in height racing across the Aegean at the speed of a jetliner, and left a caldera 11 kilometers wide where the island had once stood. The Minoan world was never the same.
The city of Akrotiri on Thera was excavated beginning in 1967 and revealed a Bronze Age Pompeii, a Minoan settlement perfectly preserved under meters of volcanic ash. Multi-story buildings stood intact, frescoes of swallows and blue monkeys and boxing children decorated the walls, storage jars still held traces of grain and oil. But there were no bodies, not a single one. The population had evacuated, apparently warned by the preliminary earthquakes that preceded the main eruption by days or weeks. They took most of their portable valuables and left. Where they went, no one knows. On Crete itself, the tsunami deposits excavated at coastal sites show waves reaching 70 meters inland, drowning the ports and harbors and fishing villages and trading stations that were the lifeblood of Minoan economic power. The great palaces on the inland plateau survived the immediate disaster, but within a generation, every single one of them had been destroyed and abandoned. By 1450 BCE, mainland Greek Mycenaeans had taken control of Crete, writing over the Minoan script with their own Linear B and erasing the last traces of a civilization that had flourished for a millennium and a half. Whether Thera alone killed the Minoans or merely wounded them fatally enough that the Mycenaeans finished the job is a debate archaeologists have not settled. But approximately 1,200 years after the eruption, a Greek philosopher named Plato wrote a detailed account of a great island civilization in the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Hercules that had sunk beneath the sea in a single day and night of violent earthquakes and floods. He described circular canals, advanced maritime culture, remarkable architecture, and catastrophic, total, irreversible destruction. He called it Atlantis. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Plato was recording a memory, however distorted by time and retelling, of what happened to Thera and the Minoans.
The details are precise enough and troubling enough that the question has never been completely closed.
What is most disturbing about the 4.2 kiloyear event is not the scale of any single collapse, it's the synchronicity. Within roughly 3 centuries centered on 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire dissolved. Egypt's old kingdom ended in famine and political fragmentation, leaving behind tomb inscriptions that describe a period when children were abandoned on roads and people ate their own children. The great early Bronze Age settlements of Anatolia, Syria, and the Aegean contracted or vanished. The Liangzhu culture of China, a sophisticated lake-dwelling civilization on the Yangtze River Delta with its own jade-working traditions and monumental architecture, was buried under catastrophic flood deposits around 2300 BCE in what appears to have been an event of staggering violence. Entire cities submerged under meters of water. And in the Indus Valley, the slow withdrawal from the great cities was already beginning. These civilizations did not know each other. They did not share religions, languages, trade connections, or political systems. Yet they collapsed within the same geological instant. A 300-year megadrought documented in stalagmites, ocean sediments, ice cores, fossil corals, and tree rings appears in the physical record from the Mediterranean to the Yellow Sea, covering roughly a third of the inhabited Earth. What caused it remains genuinely contested. Changes in the North Atlantic circulation, shifts in the Indian summer monsoon, variations in solar output, the after effects of a major volcanic eruption have all been proposed. None fully explains the global reach of the event or the precise timing of the collapses. We know the civilizations fell. We know the climate changed. The exact mechanism connecting one to the other, the specific trigger that turned a climate shift into a global extinction of Bronze Age political systems, is still being argued over in peer-reviewed journals today. 200 miles south of modern Chicago, on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River in what is now the state of Illinois, there once stood the largest city north of Mexico City. It was called Cahokia, and at its peak in the 12th century CE, it housed somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, more than lived in London at the same moment in history. The city was built around a central mound of compacted earth and clay called Monk's Mound, a structure 100 feet tall, over 900 feet long, and wider at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. 120 additional mounds rose across the landscape in every direction, earthen pyramids built basket load by hands that left no written record of the work. The Grand Plaza at the city center covered 50 acres, deliberately leveled and maintained as a ceremonial space visible for miles. Around the plaza's edges stood a circle of cedar posts aligned to the solstices and equinoxes, an astronomical observatory rebuilt 5 times over 2 centuries as its cedar poles rotted and were replaced, generation after generation maintaining the same celestial alignments their great-grandparents had established. Cahokia was the center of a religious and political movement archaeologists call Mississippian culture, a wave of ceremonial practice and artistic tradition that radiated outward from this single city across the eastern half of North America, carrying specific pottery styles, cosmological beliefs, and architectural forms from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast. It was, without question, one of the most remarkable human achievements in the history of the Americas. By 1400 CE, it was an empty field.
The decline of Cahokia began around 1200 CE and was complete by 1400 CE. The archaeological record shows the sequence clearly. Neighborhoods at the city's margins were abandoned first, their structures left standing and slowly rotting. Mound construction stopped. The palisade walls surrounding the central precinct were rebuilt and then rebuilt again, suggesting a population that felt increasingly threatened but kept trying to maintain defensive capacity. Skeletal evidence shows increasing signs of malnutrition and disease in the population during the decline phase. Environmental evidence documents deforestation of the surrounding landscape, erosion of agricultural fields, and the disappearance of local game populations, the classic signs of a city that has consumed its resource base. The onset of the Little Ice Age around 1300 CE reduced growing seasons and agricultural yields across the entire region. All of this is documented, all of it is real, and none of it fully explains what happened next, which is that the entire Mississippi River Valley around Cahokia, one of the most fertile agricultural regions in North America, was depopulated for generations. Not just Cahokia itself, the surrounding countryside, the satellite villages, the farming communities in the floodplain, all empty. People do not abandon the most productive land in their region because of a drought.
They move closer to the river. They adopt different crops. They downsize and adapt. The complete depopulation of a region suggests something more sudden and more catastrophic than gradual environmental stress. An earthquake on the New Madrid seismic fault just 150 kilometers south could have generated a magnitude 7 or 8 event. A catastrophic Mississippi River flood could have drowned the city's infrastructure in days. A religious or political crisis could have shattered the authority that held the community together overnight. And then there is the strangest part. When Europeans arrived in this region in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, they encountered Native American nations living within sight of the Great Mounds. None of them claimed to have built them. None of them had any oral tradition identifying who had. A city of 20,000 people, abandoned only 150 to 200 years earlier, had been forgotten so completely that its nearest neighbors had no memory it had ever existed.
The story of the Maya collapse is not a single event. It is 2 events separated by 3 centuries, and the second collapse is in many ways even more mysterious than the first. When the southern Maya lowland cities fell between 800 and 950 CE, the northern cities survived. Chichen Itza rose to dominate the northern Yucatan, becoming one of the most powerful cities in Mesoamerica. The Great Feathered Serpent Temple at Chichen Itza was built during this period, along with the astronomical observatory called El Caracal, the Grand Ball Court, and the Thousand-Column Hall. Trade networks expanded. Contact with the Gulf Coast and central Mexico brought new artistic and political influences. The northern Maya adapted after the southern catastrophe and built something new from the ruins of the old order. And then, between 1100 and 1200 CE, Chichen Itza itself was abandoned. The political order of the northern lowlands fragmented. A period of warfare and instability replaced the cosmopolitan confidence of the early post-collapse centuries. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Yucatan in the 1520s, what remained of Maya civilization was a collection of warring city-states, none of them remotely comparable in scale or sophistication to the great cities of the Classic period. The Spaniards burned the Maya books. In 1562, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa ordered the destruction of every Maya codex he could find, calling them works of the devil. Only 4 survived. 4 books out of what must have been thousands, containing the accumulated astronomical, historical, and ritual knowledge of a civilization that had been recording information for over 1,000 years. Whatever the Maya themselves understood about their own collapse, whatever they had written about the fall of Tikal and Palenque and Copan, whatever explanations or laments or historical analyses their scribes had inscribed on bark paper over the 3 centuries between the first and second collapses, was piled in the plaza of the town of Mani and burned in a single afternoon. At its height in the 12th and 13th century CE, the Khmer Empire of Cambodia built the largest religious complex in human history. Angkor Wat, constructed under King Suryavarman II in the early 12th century, covers over 400 acres and contains more stone than all the pyramids of Egypt combined. Its 5 towers, arranged to mirror the peaks of Mount Meru, the mythological home of the Hindu gods, are visible from miles away. Its galleries contain miles of bas-relief carvings depicting the churning of the cosmic ocean, the armies of heaven and hell, and the military victories of Khmer kings against their neighbors. But Angkor was more than a temple. It was the center of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering system of the medieval world. The Khmer built an artificial reservoir called the West Baray that holds nearly 50 million cubic meters of water, fed by a network of canals that captured monsoon rainfall and distributed it across the rice paddies surrounding the capital. The city itself, including Angkor Thom and its surrounding temple complexes, covered over 1,000 square kilometers and housed somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million people, making it by far the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. In the early 15th century, the Khmer court abandoned Angkor and relocated the capital to Phnom Penh on the coast. The jungle moved in within decades, swallowing the temples and the canals and the reservoirs and the roads. By the time European explorers encountered the ruins in the 19th century, the surrounding population had no clear memory of who had built them. For decades, historians attributed the abandonment of Angkor to the military threat of the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, which sacked the city multiple times in the 14th and early 15th centuries. War as an explanation for collapse is always appealing because it's simple and visible. Armies leave burned buildings. But tree ring data extracted from centuries-old trees in the region and published by Brendan Buckley and his colleagues
revealed something that changed the understanding of Angkor's fall entirely. The 14th century saw two prolonged and devastating droughts separated by episodes of extreme flooding, mega monsoons that sent water crashing through the delicate canal networks the city depended on, silting them up, eroding their banks, and destroying the hydraulic infrastructure that had taken generations to construct. The engineering that had made Angkor possible was precision equipment. It required constant maintenance and careful management of water flow across thousands of kilometers of canals and reservoirs. Extreme drought emptied the reservoirs. Extreme rainfall overwhelmed them. The alternation of these two extremes over decades degraded the system beyond the capacity of any administration to repair. Food production declined. The city could no longer support its enormous population. When the Thai armies came, they were not conquering a thriving empire. They were delivering the final blow to a civilization already fatally weakened by a climate the engineers who built the Great Water System had never anticipated. The irony is profound. The hydraulic system that made Angkor the most populous city on Earth was also what made it most vulnerable. The sophistication was inseparable from the fragility.
Step back from the individual stories and look at what they have in common. The Maya built 2,000 cities and then watched drought kill the southern ones while the northern ones survived for 3 more centuries before falling to their own second collapse. The Akkadian Empire built the world's first empire on the most fertile land in the Near East and was dissolved by a drought that science now tells us covered a third of the inhabited world simultaneously. The Indus Valley built the most advanced urban planning system of the Bronze Age and vanished without leaving a single readable word explaining why. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed 8 interconnected civilizations within 50 years, a catastrophe so total that literacy itself nearly disappeared from the Mediterranean. The Sanxingdui of China built bronze masks that still defy explanation, burned their most sacred objects, and moved away without a written record. The Minoans dominated the Aegean for 1,500 years and were erased so completely that a philosopher writing 12 centuries later may have been preserving a garbled memory of their destruction. Cahokia was the largest city in North America and was forgotten by its own neighbors within 2 centuries of its abandonment. The Khmer built the largest religious structure on Earth and were brought down not by their enemies, but by the alternating droughts and floods that undermined the hydraulic miracle that fed their million-person city. In every case, the mainstream explanation is rational, evidence-based, and incomplete. In every case, the evidence explains most of what happened and fails to explain all of it. And in every case, what remains unexplained is the most interesting part.
What these disasters actually teach us is not what we usually think they do. We learned about them in the context of the past, as historical curiosities, as cautionary tales about civilizations that made mistakes we would never make. But the real lesson is different and considerably more uncomfortable. Every single civilization covered here believed it was permanent. The Akkadian scribes who recorded the empire's grain inventories did not write their tablets thinking they would be the last records of a dying state. The Maya astronomers who tracked the movements of Venus across the night sky with extraordinary precision did not build their observatories expecting that within a century there would be no one left to read the results. The engineers who designed Angkor's canal network did not construct a hydraulic system capable of feeding 1 million people while simultaneously planning for that system's complete collapse. They built for permanence. They built for continuity. They built assuming that the world they knew would persist, because it always had. And the climate changed, or the mountain exploded, or the rain stopped, or the complexity that made them powerful became the mechanism of their destruction. The sophistication that distinguished them from their neighbors, the very thing that made them civilizations rather than villages, was also what made them brittle. A village can survive a drought. A city of 100,000 cannot. Not when every one of those 100,000 people depends on systems of food production, water management, and trade so specialized and so interconnected that a single sustained disruption cascades through the entire structure before anyone has time to understand what is happening. We live in the most complex, most specialized, most globally interconnected civilization in human history. The ruins of every civilization on this list were, in the years before their collapse, considered permanent. This is not a history lesson. It is a mirror.